usually a day before, Craig will send me some ideas, the sorts of things we're going to talk about. And we did want to spend a little bit of time in terms of leadership lessons from the book of Luke to talk about the crucifixion, because, of course, we're coming right up to Easter. We're in the middle of that preparation week before Easter. Good Friday, of course, is coming up on the 7th of April, and Easter Sunday on the 9th, and it is a good time for us to be reflecting on the crucifixion of Jesus. We were talking a little bit earlier about the preeminence of politics in relation to the arrest of Donald Trump. And Jesus, of course, he was crucified for political reasons. The religious leaders of his day, the chief priests, the elders, the scribes, and of course the high priest, and those who had been in that position previous to Caiaphas being appointed by the Romans, who'd made all the appointments of the high priests, they decided that Jesus was a threat to their establishment and made up their minds that they were going to get rid of him. It was pretty hard to get rid of him, actually, because the religious leaders only had authority to execute people for certain infringements of temple customs and temple laws. They weren't able to crucify people at all. That was something that only the Romans could do, and they could only execute people under very, very limited circumstances. So they had to find some way of being able to accuse Jesus of insurrection, and that was really what they were trying to do. It was a pretty difficult thing for them to prove. Also, of course, they had to do everything pretty much in secret because they were frightened of the crowd. You see, the ordinary Jew was pretty much on the side of Jesus, and we saw the evidence of that on the first Palm Sunday as people welcomed Jesus as he rode a donkey into Jerusalem. They cried out, "Hosanna, Lord, save us." So they recognized him as Messiah. That was very inconvenient for the religious leaders because the message that he was preaching and had preached consistently since his first public appearance about 3 years prior was a message that would actually undermine their economic position. The religious leaders were very, very wealthy, and they made their wealth largely off the back of ordinary Jews. So they had to do this in secret because they knew that the ordinary Jews would rise up against them. He was arrested in the night, of course, which is why somebody had to point him out to the soldiers who were probably temple guards. And Judas, of course, performed that role for them. And they paid him 30 pieces of silver, which was the price of a slave, or if you like, the price of a life back then. He first went to Annas, who was father-in-law of the current high priest, Caiaphas. Annas himself had been a high priest, and he questioned Jesus, but really Jesus didn't answer the questions that were put to him. And so Annas could find nothing to accuse him of and sent him to Caiaphas. Caiaphas more or less eventually pushed Jesus into declaring that he was the Son of God. That was an issue, of course, because claiming to be a Son of God was no crime, but claiming to be the Son of God was tantamount to saying, "I am the Messiah," which greatly offended the ruling religious class. It's interesting that 2 witnesses were eventually found to testify against him. It's very interesting that their accusation was that he had said, "I will tear down the temple and build it up again in 3 days." They actually misquoted him because he never made any claims that he would tear down the temple. He said, "If you tear down this temple, I will rebuild it in 3 days." And of course, we understand now that he was referring to himself, but he certainly never said, "I will tear down the temple." He was misquoted by 2 witnesses who were obviously not reliable at all. The Sanhedrin, of course, roughly equivalent of the British House of Lords, not elected, they're all appointed. They heard, and they ended up declaring that he was a blasphemer because of the claim that he made about being the Son of God. They turned him over to the Roman authorities, but the interesting thing was the Roman authorities couldn't execute anybody who blasphemed the Jewish God. And of course, Pilate could find no crime that he had committed, sent him to Herod. Herod himself could find no crime. He goes back to Pilate, and Pilate continually insisted that he could find no fault in Jesus, but ultimately he gave in and had Jesus crucified because of the crowd, which was most likely a renter crowd from people who didn't even live in Jerusalem, so they probably weren't aware of the ministry of Jesus. This renter crowd cried out for the life of Barabbas, and of course we now know that Jesus ended up being crucified. You know, he was never ever pronounced guilty of a crime against the Romans, and yet he was crucified in the same way as an insurrectionist. And Barabbas, as far as we know, was actually an insurrectionist. So there you have it. He was essentially crucified for political reasons, and it wasn't really political in terms of his opposition to the Romans. It was political in terms of the kingdom that he was announcing, which was a kingdom that didn't suit the powerful and wealthy religious elite.
Hey, that was an excerpt from our On the Cube Leadership podcast. If you enjoyed it, give it a thumbs up, put a comment below. And if you want to see more content like this, faith-based leadership development content, make sure you check out our channel, give it a subscribe, and hit the bell notification so that you'll be notified when we release new content.